Uh, yeah, so my question is, in terms of the Perry model, was that also premised on low-rise housing or low-rise construction generally? And I mean, would the model survive if developments were converted in with a high-rise kind of development model? Right, that's one. And secondly, how did the NIT space contrast compare with the Huda sectors that were developed later? And was there a conscious departure from the Perry plan by Huda when it developed the rest of it?
Here in India, we've actually made a mess of our towns and cities. Here in India, we've made a mess of our towns and cities, and Faridabad is, I mean, it looks like a mess. A city or a town should be a happy place where people can live, where there's greenery, where there's, waste is taken care of, etc., etc. But it's a total mess. But the US, Europe, they managed to sort of have nice cities, have nice habitation for people to live in. Because there's so many people living in cities and towns, and there's a move towards urbanization, unfortunately. So and Faridabad is an example of this total mess actually. And except for maybe Chandigarh and Delhi to some extent, all the other cities and towns are totally in a mess. So is it because the reason is obviously the bureaucrats, the city planners, the town planners, whoever. I mean, what were they thinking of when they sort of came up with some sort of plan for these small towns all over the country and these cities? What did they have in mind? It was really bad. And Gurgaon was another example of that bad planning. you know. So, I mean, it's a total mess here in India, and I don't know if we can ever solve this problem. I don't think we can solve this problem ever. We'll be living endlessly forever in this total urban messy scenario.
Well, just a question. Yeah, no, in the concluding remarks you passed and you said I'm not going to give the detail, but if we have time I would like to have more detail, mentioning that there was also slum, which can be seen as a kind of failure of planning, but could you tell a little bit more? Who are the residents of this slum? They're also refugees who could not be accommodated, or it's later migration of industrial workers?
Yeah, maybe I can. Yeah, sure. I think the Perry model was largely seeing the low-rise construction only. There was no concept of high-rise construction at that point in time. And it was more of a neighborhood. And if you see even in Faridabad, so all this was, there are only single rooms houses available. So all this changes which has happened is making the first floor and all is a much later amendment. So it has nothing to do with the original plan, the way Perry had formulated. It was in the same way it was brought about in Faridabad. But regarding the distinction between how Huda had nothing to do with Perry's formulation. So these sectors come in 30, 40 years later. And but they are the bungalows. So again, they give you a lot of space. You can buy the land space and build your own bungalow. It's up to you. Maximum, I'm sure that even these are not high-rise buildings. So it's a bungalow is like either 2-storied or 1-storied. And they had nothing to do. They didn't even want to replicate any kind of thing, because this, if you look at the city, as I said, these are various locational variants. So if you go to NIT, it's very different than the way the sectors have developed, because most of the people who have retired or civil servants, they have settled in these Huta sectors post 1980s. So and people who have done better, like I'm not mentioned the refugees who actually, Lakhanis is one of them, who started in Faridabad, and they got the industries and all. So once they kind of did well, so they moved away from, so moving away from NIT to the sector is also reflective of your economic entrepreneurship and going to a higher and better place to stay. So I think the bleak picture you portray is true, but I think Faridabad is not so bad as Gurgaon, because Gurgaon is unplanned. Faridabad was a planned city, and I didn't mention the green belt, but green belt has a lot of laws, and slowly and steadily how these green belts are not really taken cognizance of, because certain areas you're not supposed to have construction there. But if you look at most of the high-rise buildings which are coming is actually on these green belts and the farmhouses, which are totally, I don't know whether it's illegality or passing of the laws, how these green belts were supposed to be always there. What probably Ebenezer Howard had talked about this town and country magnet in Britain, and which they always preserved. But in India, I don't think we have there's no sanctity attached to green belts when it comes to construction and urbanization. So I would say Faridabad is not so bad an example as vis-a-vis Gurgaon is. And in fact, Gurgaon was not supposed to develop. At the time when Faridabad comes in, there was this whole idea that Gurgaon doesn't have a water level. So how can you have residential buildings? And that's why it's in a total infrastructure chaos, because you have built in a city, but there is no infrastructure to support the city. So ground level was always low. So when Nehru was given this, they had this option of going to Gurgaon vis-a-vis Faridabad, build Faridabad. They realized the water level is so low that it cannot really sustain the city. So that was one option they took. And as regards the slums, in the initial period, I think all the refugees who came in were given the same kind of treatment. So they did, I have not really looked into it, but people who were actually given Palwal and other areas, they came from a very lower, that's why I say the class differentiation is there. These were mostly the traders who were able to show certain kind of papers saying that if this can be, instead of this, what we have lost in in Pakistan, we should be given a house. So this was a more mercantile class which settled in NIT region. But those who came from really lower class, I think there can be a whole different study, because the Palwal region and all, they were given these mud houses to stay. They were not part of the planned city of NIT region.
So they were given
mud houses, right? Kacha houses, not the Pakka houses which were built in the NIT region. But the slums definitely is more a post 1970s phenomenon when it becomes an industrial city and migration comes from Bihar regions, and people from Rajasthan, UP and Bihar are coming and flocking here for jobs in Faridabad. So then slums and Khoka development has become part of Faridabad, because that was never conceived in the initial plan that the slums would come up. These industries were basically to rehabilitate the refugees. It did not take into consideration the migration flow later on which would happen.
In the type of housing which was provided, so some were Paka house and some were Kacha house, or it was just
not in NIT region. No, not in the NIT region. NIT region had the similar kind of houses. I've not gone into the study of the other houses which would be towards Palwal side, and the ones who came from really lower classes or probably lower caste from Pakistan. So that could be another study altogether. I think we will.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier in the critiques of the neighborhood unit that some people criticize its insularity, right? The idea that it was an island, but to some extent that was what Perry envisioned for the success of the neighborhood unit, creating this idea of island where people in the neighborhood had ownership of that public space and felt sort of, like a community precisely. In your research, did you encounter any idea that maybe it could be related, the success or failure of the neighborhood unit in a context like the Indian one, to maybe cultural difference as they relate to public space, to open space, to the idea of community being rather than geographical, maybe being religious, of caste, etc. And in your research, have you come to a conclusion whether or not Perry's neighborhood unit is universal or is specific to one cultural geographical context in the world?
You just mentioned the Mumfords, and I did not see the link very well with Perry's. What was he doing? He had also a different vision of what could be neighborhood unit, because I see more the historical work that he did rather than that, so I just wanted clarification. And the other clarification is, you say with the arrival of Huda, there's also a strong change in imperatives of planning. But you did not develop what was the change in the imperatives of planning compared to the pre-Huda period, and the fact that it's linked, I think, with this bifurcation of separate administration. But you say it shaped Faridabad, but in which way? I'm not very clear how the fact that suddenly there's different administration intervening actually changed the trajectory of the city or not. So if you can just clarify that.
After the Huda came, then it was more of like the gated community, and previously we were talking about the NIT. So I want to know in relation how Perry is talking about the neighborhood, which we are thinking is the NIT. Is it is like a self independent kind, which is self sustaining. You said, but then again you were talking about the Shesha Suri Marg and the NH2. So it had a very good transport line, but still we see that its connection to Delhi is not so that good. So if you're talking about an isolated piece of land, then how is it the connection to the city, or how is it like self-sustaining, or the intercommunal community relationship which is taking place of a newly formed society? So I just want to know how was it in the NIT kind of region, and after the intervening of the Huda government forming gated communities.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you very much for giving, the historical perspective of the city of Faridabad. But I have visited Faridabad in a very, alternate. There are plots of the size of 800 square yards in which our relations have lived. And it has been an industrial town, as you rightly said, from 70s to 90s, and it was a big town with having lot of big industries there. And now my question is that when you say that it is a refugee, settlement, and then you again name it as an industrial settlement, so there is a very vast difference, and that has to be broadly explained, as she has also spoken about of the poor transportability, and the communication was very poor, and the maintenance was also not to the mark. And my, the next question is, when you are asking for an industrial town, what the planners are doing when they are not providing the proper university there? If you don't have a proper college, degree college or a university, how can you ask the industrial town to develop? Every industrial town has to be developed with the proper, industrialization. Without education cannot progress. So there was a big handicap for that township, and people from when the industry was working, people were settling of the higher status. But as soon as they found that the things are not good for their children, they moved from there to Gurgaon. Gurgaon became because they had some education background. So why this particular phases was missing in industrialization and refugee colony when they have done, and why the communication, as has been pointed out, what was the, in your studies you found that there were certain gaps in these city. Thank you.
Okay. I think the first point regarding the insularity, which was seen from Perry's formulation, right? So what I'm trying to say is that when Perry was saying that the space become deterministic of the relationships, what has happened in Faridabad, it's the relationships, the biradri, the kinship, which has become deterministic of the way they are spaced out there. So it's not that it was about intercommunicability or Bannu and Mardan biradri could stay together. You know? That's what probably Perry would have idealized, ideally seen, visualized in that place. But what is happening here is, again, the same kind of Northwest Frontier province. If you map it onto what I said in Faridabad, the same people have stayed together within their own kinship. And the nodal point which Perry said would be the school and the community centers where people from different backgrounds would come together and interact. But here it was the Gurdwaras. So Bannu Biradri has its separate Gurdwara from Mardan Biradri. The Dera Ismail Khan have their separate temples, which is where they interact with each other. So it is an inversion of what Perry had earlier formulated, or yeah. And I'm saying it has been adapted to in a different plan. Right? So the idea of planning was taken from there, that this is how the neighborhood unit is and how the planning of the arterial streets and all. But it has been adapted to the context of post-partition rehabilitation. Well, that's what the government wanted initially, but then they gave in to what the kinship desire was, right? As regards the pre-Huda and the Huda government, I think Mary's question, as I said, the main difference was that the Huda sectors which were developed is for the people who could pay for those plots. And that is very different from what the NIT region entailed. NIT region was for everyone who had come and migrated from after partition, right? So it was, they were given those on the basis of doles and wages, those lands, and they could build their own houses. They were given, obviously, all the planning was directed to them. But when it comes to the Huda, it's all who can pay and how much land you can acquire and then build your own house. So bungalows are something different from the way the Huda city has been planned. And of course, you rightly points out that how Lewis Mumford sits in, because he's a more a philosopher, a historian, who's like kind of saying that what Perry was trying to say is that this mere cohabitation to the creation of, what he says is that Perry wanted to move beyond this mere idea of cohabitation to creating a new form and new institution of modern urban community. So he's just philosophizing. He's not giving any ideas of how it happened and all. He's just kind of giving a philosophical take to it. As regards your question, I can club it with yours. There is definitely, when Faridabad was initially planned, there was definitely, despite having the NH2, it was not very connected because the government only planned the NIT region. They did not plan much the transport and the road to Delhi. Idea was that it should insulate, otherwise these people will keep migrating back to Delhi. And exactly that's what happens in 1980s. Once Huda starts taking over the sectors, people found that the city is good, the houses are good, but it lacks all the recreational creativity which Delhi has. So people started purchasing plots, and then it goes down. The market value of those plots goes down because people realize that they cannot find that recreational value which is there in Delhi vis-a-vis Faridabad. So they just purchased the land and they started migrating. They shifted back to Delhi and preferred to stay in Delhi and move to Faridabad than so it was just becomes a workstation. That's why I say that this difference becomes important, that it becomes a satellite town to Delhi, which was supposed to be initially a town in itself, right? So in 80s, the market value, and even today, the market value still goes down, and vis-a-vis glitzy Gurgaon, it is not so a preferable destination to stay there. Otherwise, the land rates are far more lower as Gurgaon in Faridabad. So, and how do I contrast it? Is why the NIT region is still more vibrant, because after people shifted, they initially worked in the factories, the industries, and there are different kinds of industries if you map on. So the early industries were the Bata, the Jankidas cycle, and all these industries, they were, and the cooperative units, which were specifically only for the refugees. The later ribbon development which has happened in all these industries, escorts and all you see, has come up only after the coming of Huda. These industries are much later, where all the migrants from other parts of the country are coming here. So the early industries was just to rehabilitate the refugees which were near the NIT region. And most of these refugees initially worked in these industries but moved out because they were traders and merchants. So they said that we'll set up our own shops. So each neighborhood unit had their own shops, and they stopped working in these industries because they found it degrading after some point in time, and they went back to their original profession. So these other industries which have come up is where the migrant labor is from Rajasthan, UP and other parts. If you look at the education system, it was very different, so I didn't actually go into it. So initial education system was supposed to be on the vocational training, and Asha Devi Aryankam and all these people were part of the Faridabad planning board. So they said that there should be vocational training and all. But the cooperative unit, which was run by Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay, was later on taken off from Faridabad, and people started educating themselves. Those who had come in from NWFP, they started opening small schools for this. So NIT region had a very different kind of a schooling vis-a-vis the sectors which come up much later. So all that you see, Manav, Rachna and all this has come only very of late in 19. But if you actually see, there were no universities and all in the early part of Faridabad. Because people used to have this cooperative trainings, and those under the ICU, Indian Cooperative Union, certain kinds of schools were opened, but they were basically vocational schools so that people, even children, could get jobs rather than teaching. So there was something called nursery teachers training for some part and all, but that cooperative union later on is taken away from Faridabad.
Just to go back to one of the first inversion of Perry's neighborhood unit that you spoke about, where instead of the space determining social relationships, and there was a continuum of relationships. So, on the one hand, I mean, from what I gathered, people from different districts and sort of parts of the northwest frontier provinces ended up staying together in the same neighborhood units. But was there any attempt to, as in, was there any intervention made within the neighborhood unit? Because I can imagine in the original communities there being some sort of caste segregation, for instance, and different communities living on the outskirts of the district, etc. Did the government seek to break any of those characteristics within the neighborhood unit itself? And so just that.
I don't think that the caste segregation, they take it very seriously. So when I talk about caste, explicitly they don't talk about it. They say it is our biradri. We don't have caste system, which can be false, because they say within Mardan biradri we stay together. And even if the language, if you see, the Punjabis, Punjabi language they use, I'm a Punjabi, I can't understand the Bannu biradri Punjabi, but they speak the Mardan biradri Punjabi, and Dera Ismail Khan has a different language altogether. So within the communities, I don't think the government would have interfered so much, because they wanted them to at least peacefully settle once they're there. And when they were building houses, there should be no more skirmishes amongst them, right? So they were given the same plot of land, but the people from the same communities were asked to develop those plots of land according to the plans which were given to them. Huda. It's completely come up after Huda. Haryana Urban Development Authority.
Doesn't belong to any of the...
No. It's the urban. Yeah, it's under Huda.
You briefly mentioned that there was the Mayo community already there who was displaced. So, little bit on, has there been work or has there been any documentation about their displacement? Also, I got the impression that they were sort of moved away completely. Yeah. So, does that mean that no original sort of settlements remained after Faridabad was developed? I mean, I didn't quite get that. So, my question is related to the neighborhood unit and communities being resettled together. So while I understand this is a different context and we're talking about post-partition resettlement, much of the contemporary literature on relocation talks about how community ties being disrupted is actually a problematic fallout of the resettlement process. So how do you contrast that with a case wherein there perhaps has been a conscious attempt to take note of community ties by the state planning? And two, do you have data from your research in terms of what sense do people themselves make of this kind of a relocation? Like, I mean, I understand the critique about lack of assimilation, segregation does, but what is the people's own perception of this kind of a resettlement? Do they do they look at it as a positive in terms of community ties being furthered? How, and if at all, do you have anything about what is the relationship to the other neighborhoods? So what are the forms of interaction, or is there a lack of interaction?
Many of the questions I had in mind are sort of asked. I just want to move it away. Could you also reflect on what does the violence and what does violence
do in terms of how the cities were planned? The conscious attempt to keep them away from, because Delhi was at that time erupting with violence with both Muslims being moved to certain parts of the city as well as with incoming refugees.
I think Gupta's early question about the Abadis and people who were already staying there. So Mewatis were first, there was a very small population of Mewatis who were moved to Gurgaon, and they were told that they would be getting better land, right? and on that basis they were moved. And this is a very interesting population because they were Muslims and Hindus both. So it was very difficult to disaggregate what religion they followed and all. And since partition was that moving away of Muslim population, so it was not still sure where they would be resettled. Then even in Gurgaon, they were not given enough land, and they later on moved to Ajmer and especially to Rajasthan area, right? But Shair Mayaram has a more interesting work on this in details, how Mewatis were done, were resettled. As regards the people here, they belong to mostly villagers, and these villagers were again moved out and shifted to Palwal and other regions, near the Balkal Lake and all. Even that region is very strongly Mewati region till today, certain kind of there. But I've not really looked into it in detail to be able to explain to you that what happened to the ones who were there already. I think one of the questions which is about violence, and I can just club the two together, how these people remember the violences, as we know that there have been no national monuments to memorialization of partition itself. So in Faridabad there is a very important Gurdwara which is called Gurdwara Shahidan-e Gujarat train. And in Bannu Biradri every year they meet and they remember the Gujarat train. Gujarat is in Pakistan, not in India. The Gujarat train which was butchered, and most of the people from Bannu Biradri were coming from that train. So around 1,000 people or people who were butchered on the train, and they remember this and memorialize through that Gurdwara. And it's an everyday Gurdwara, but it's named that Shahidan-e Gujarat train Gurdwara, where they remember the people who had gone through violence. And in the memory of those people, every day they meet and pray. And once a year, they have this commemoration of this Gurdwara. So these places is how they belong to the space. So even when they move in, they have created their own spaces of remembering the home and hearth of partition, which was before that. And of course, creating those kinship ties. How do they interact with each other? Of course, now Hindi has become a medium, and it's very important to remember that Pushto as a was their language. And they still remember Pushto as their language, and why, with the coming of nationalization, Hindi was forced onto them. So they were all Urdu-speaking population. They're coming from Pakistan. They're all Punjabis, but they were all Pathanis, and many of them you would see they wear Pathani. So you would actually mistake them for being Muslims, but they are Hindu Pathans. And they actually belong to Khudai Khidmatkar, Badshah Khan. So they have these kind of memorials in the city where they remember that Badshah Khan in fact visited and he said, these are my people. So Mehru, you have to take care of them when you are resettling them. So I have not mentioned much of Nehru's role, but Nehru was very instrumental in resettling these people from Faridabad because it was his close relationship with Badshah Khan. That's why all these people from NWFP are settled in this place. Disruption and Isha.
Compared to the contemporary literature, which is been largely in the context of eviction of the urban poor, wherein community ties being broken are seen as a substantial fallout and of the resettlement process itself, and therefore new struggles and coping and adaptation takes place because your former ties have been broken. In this context, how do you see an attempt by the state to preserve ties and thereby relocate in a manner wherein the Biradaris are...
It's very clear that they allowed them to stay the way they wanted to.
But also, how do you see the various Biradaris themselves? So, what are the levels? Do you find, are there levels of interaction?
I said because Hindi becomes an important point of interaction. So they do have to interact now, right? I mean, even though they want to retain their ethnic ties with the Mardan Biradri and all, but so when they're talking amongst themselves, they're talking in that Banuwal language, right? When you go to the shopping center, the moment someone else comes from a Mardan Biradri and they are talking, they'll talk about the changes in the food. They'll say, we do not eat such spicy food as Banu Biradri does. So there are certain minimum cultural differences. I think marriages now, they say earlier we would not marry in Banu al-Biradri or this, they are supposed to be very cunning people and all. But now I think over a period of time it's become very open to the idea that if there is people who are interested in the other Biradri. So ethnic ties are still there, but it is overrun by the class ties nowadays.
Sorry. So I had a question very specific to the community centers. How is the Perry model different than the Huda model? Because you mentioned they were designed in a certain way. The spatial design was meant to foster community participation.
So, Huda model has nothing to do with Perry model. It's in the NIT region where Clarence Perry's model was used for the neighborhood region, right? So the neighborhood had a community center, but that's what I'm saying, that the community center does not become, or the schools do not become a point of interaction for these people. Yeah.
At that stage, did they? During the Perry models, were they?
Yeah, it did. But again, in Perry model, it has been inverted in different ways, as I said. It did create in the post-Second World War period these Negroes and Polish people. They started segregating and staying in their own neighborhoods, just as we talk about these Mardan Biradaris and all staying. So even though it was envisioning a space where everyone comes face-to-face contact, and regardless of school would be a place where the parents would also interact, no matter what background you're coming from, right? That was the, so Perry model has been inverted in American neighborhoods as well, right? I'm just talking of its adaptation, how it happens here in a particular context.
So quick, 3-4 things. This is first, if you one of the issues is this whole issue of social services, right, which came up quite a bit, and to what extent did and you mentioned that Perry was largely a residential planning story. So to what extent did the government at that time actually plan for social services, whether it's education, whether it's health, whether it's structures in that sense? But most importantly, I was just curious about 2-3 kinds of things. One, and the broad issue is, given that it is the same neighborhood planning story, but it's being taken up by 5 different communities in close proximity, how do these neighborhoods differ from each other? Whether it's in the nature of the fabric, the kind of houses they build, in the nature of the interactions, the way they place their shops. I mean, can you, given that the physical layout was, my understanding is similar, how does the layouts of these, the realized layouts in some sense, of these different areas vary, and what does it, and can you draw inferences about that from the way interaction has taken place in this particular area? The second issue is the, sort of to expand on Mukhtar's question, the pink area that you have, which is this new development that comes up. As you said, Faridabad doesn't really have a story of urban villages that you have in Gurgaon, because the Abadi areas are also sort of moved out in that space. So, what is, in some sense, the genesis of these new areas? Whose land is it? How is it transformed? Who is doing that transformation? And to the extent that it happens outside of the Huda story, you spoke of the Huda story and you spoke of the NIT story. This new transformation that is happening, what model does it follow? Does it draw upon either the Huda model or the Perry model? Right. That's the second.
Okay. Regarding the social service plan, which was initially in the NIT region, I'll just speak about the NIT region. the health and the education service were largely looked after by the Indian Cooperative Union, which was under Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay. So health was, there was one hospital. If you look at the NIT region, this is called Badshah Khan Hospital. It's called BK. So BK is BK bus stop, BK library. It all stands for Badshah Khan because everything was, kind of reminding them of where they're coming from. So that was one of the hospitals which was initially set up in Faridabad. And education, as I said, initially the Indian Cooperative.
Staffed by people in
Yeah.
Delhi, or the doctors were locally?
I think from Delhi they would go. So initially it was not very well staffed, but later on, of course, they had people from locals who kind of come in. But that is the only hospital which is still there today and functional as well. And regarding the education services, as I said, that it was the refugees themselves. There were people who had come from Pakistan, and they were, one or two of them were in the education sector. So they started this school, and this school, the person has just passed away. He's 90-year-old. His school he started, he said it's for the refugees so that they do not miss the classes, because the government had not yet started with formal schooling there initially. So they had their own school, and it's still running there. But the higher education was not there in NIT region. Primary schools come in much later, I think, in 60s and 70s, but not initially. So people who have studied from that school, the refugees, and they're now 60, 70-year-old, they really appreciate that person's effort who came from Pakistan and set up that school. And so Indian... It was one as school, yeah.
Is it something that is this a space where different communities are coming in?
Yes, initially. It is a space where different communities are coming in and studying. And so later on, of course, the other schools must have come up, but at what I got, the earlier school, this was one of them. And even the colleges comes in much later, in 70s and 80s, right? Now, what you're talking about, how different. Now, physically, the space is the same. When it came to giving them the plots of land, how much they had to pay for that plot of land, how to develop the land, the space, the planning of the houses was the similar, whether it is for Mardan, NH4, NH3, NH2, NH1. But the people from those communities were kind of the ones who built the houses in those areas. So culturally, it can be a different space. Like for Banuwals, Gurdwara is an important, though they are all Hindus, but they go to a Gurdwara because that is how they were in Pakistan as well. So for them, Gurdwara is a more important place. So most of the Gurdwaras which you find in Faridabad is where people from Hindu communities visit. There are no Sardars actually in that kind of Gurdwara. They are very different from the Singh Sabha Gurdwaras which we have in Delhi. And that is where the Bannu community goes. The Dera Ismail Khan community, they have temples. And this whole idea of Jhulelal and all, it comes from that. And one of that community is also in Delhi. It meets in Kalkaji. These are the ones who are settled in Kalkaji are from Dera Ismail Khan. So they have more links with this Dera Ismail community in Kalkaji with the Faridabad community, Dera Ismail Khan community which is settled in Faridabad. So I'm sure they have interaction amongst them, but their meeting points are very different.
The physical form of the house
is the same.
They had to build exactly.
Yes, exactly the same.
And they all followed the...
Yes, they all followed. They followed the instruction, thankfully. And regarding the pink space which you say, even I have not studied that portion. And I think this is much later development. Perry's model ends with NIT. It was just used as a plan template for NIT region for residential planning. It has nothing to do with Huda. It has nothing to do with the now kind of development. Huda has nothing to do with it. So it ends in 1948 to 52 till it was used as a planned template for these regions, because that was what the buzzword, that how you make neighborhoods.
Yes, but the reason you're asking the question is, if you look at it, say, Gurgaon, Gurgaon is looking at layouts, the planned layouts. In some senses, you look at what DLF was doing in Delhi in the 1950s and what DDA did after that. There is in some sense the use of models of DDA. They are planned colonies. The colonies themselves are much more, but there's the whole issue of the central park, structure, and so on and so forth. That's what gets transported, because this is seen as the aspirational way to get there, planned way to get there. I'm just wondering whether the NIT model, whether it acquired any aspirational value. Did people want to live in that kind of space? or when they were allowed to sort of build their own areas, did they revert back to what their perhaps the space was in, let's say, NW? For example, I don't know whether you have studied what the urban form was in the places where they migrated from, and whether there's a reversion to type or there's something else that's moving through. I'm just curious about this notion of how planning and architecture are.
I think religious centers become very prominent here, which was there in Pakistan as well. So it is not the community center which Perry is kind of advocating. So it is always, even today when you go, every day they will visit a Gurudwara. For them that's a must. And these Gurudwaras are not... The younger ones, of course not. They don't really relate to it, but still they are being told about what BK is, what Badshah Khan is. So many of the younger generation doesn't know what does BK stand for. Right? And what in this Badshah Khan library, there are hardly any people who visit the library. But this person, every day he goes and sits there and he says, he's got photographs of Badshah Khan there, and he says, in memory of Badshah Khan, I want to maintain and let go of, this. And there are only newspapers in the library, nothing else, no books, nothing. So it's just a space which is created. So maybe this is one space which was created, not envisioned in the earlier spaces, but just to have a memory of the person whom they associated with by creating this space. So maybe these spaces are something which is again not in the original plan. But when it comes to houses, it was a very rigid implication of how they're supposed to be built.
Even the markets with community shops,
Yeah.
their own markets.
So community shops was the community center or the shopping center, as in Perry's formulation, was supposed to be another area which is a walking distance. So they all have that. Every neighborhood has its own NH1 market. It's for Bannus. It's not just Bannus, but people, since they stay there, they are the ones who've opened the markets there. NH3 has its own market. NH4 has its own market. But what has happened is the market was supposed to be a designated area. Now what happens is, what they have converted their own houses into market, which happens even in Delhi, in Lajpat Nagar and all. These are supposed to be just houses. But because of their need, they realize that they have to convert the housing space into. Yeah. So it was not supposed to be, these are all residential places, Lajpat Nagar, Kalkaji and all. But if you see, the house is now on the first floor and the ground floor. So this is all again an inversion of Perry's plan altogether, but also the need of the hour.
You think people don't shop in each other?
They do. That's what I'm saying, that now it's the language barrier is broken. Now it's not that this is theirs, this is ours. But definitely when it comes to community centers, they have their own, in fact, when you're talking about the social services, they have their own social service leagues or Seva Sadans, which they have said that we used to have in Pakistan. So we have the same kind of leagues where we help each other through those community service centers. So that is again separate for each community.
Do you have a good sense of this evolution of the slow breaking down of these barriers? I mean, starting to let's say 1950s till let's say 1970s, 80s.
Yeah, so it's very,
process,
yeah.
Or, and to what extent, for example, to make the question very specific, these people who went to that common school that you spoke about, did they play any part in making these barriers weaker because of that interaction, or do you have a sense of?
I think ethnic ties are very strong. Just that they do now they do interact with each other. But when I said that when it comes to cultural and when it comes to marriage, earlier the marriage was not allowed between communities. But now it's much more loose and flexible in terms of the marriage relations and all that, and people moving. But they really deter their children not to marry outside their communities. But as I said, it's very different if you look at 80s, 90s, the development which is happening even in NIT. So those who are doing well, they want to move to the sectors. Most of the industrialists who have come, who've really acquired, they don't want to stay in that one or two room set. They have made it like the workshops now. And they have moved to Lakhanis have made it the workshop where they used to stay. Now they have moved to the sectors. And similarly, Kathuria and all who came post-partition, the major industrialists, they all stay in sectors. They don't stay in the neighborhood. But they have memories of neighborhood, so they say we won't sell this house because this is where our parents came and they struggled. So,
Are there people migrating into the sector?
yes. The ones who are doing affluent, the ones who become affluent from NIT.
Are the people migrating into NIT from other?
No.
Is the NIT itself
No.
becoming less cohesive?
That I have not really looked into, but definitely there is this whole aspiration is to move towards the sectors.
You mentioned that
1907, yeah.
So is that also the time from when it has been occupied? And
Yeah.
one question that we asked was that whose lands were these? That building, so where did those people go? Was it also settled there?
No, they've been shifted out towards, as I said, Palwal, Kodal, these areas, they've been totally, they were basically the agriculturalists. So it was actually a very agricultural kind of an area. Mewatis have moved out. They have gone to first initially Gurgaon and later on shifted to Rajasthan. But if you look at the sector 18, it's still very different from the others. So there is a considerable population of, but now you can't trace them back to the pre-1947 population there. So of course these people are also the migrants who have come now in the 1970s and 80s from UP, Bihar and all. So, but this is the initial founding point of Faridabad. That's how it's.
But there's nothing left of village common.
No, nothing. No.
But it's been occupied since.
Yeah.
Thanks for the presentation. I want to know, you talk about that unlike schools and then community centers, it's the religious centers which are basically gurdwaras and temples which are the main focal as such. But what about cultural practices? Are there some cultural practices that are from the eminent or from the place where they have migrated from, trying to recreate or at least memorize, people retain the memory of those places, and or as to build up the communities to retain the identity as distinct communities. Are there any cultural practices?
So one is definitely the memorialization of violence, which is there in this Gurudwara. The other kind of cultural practices is that for them, singing is something which, and even shairi competitions used to be held earlier. So there was a very famous shair who came from Faridabad. He was a very important poetic forms shairi. So there was a very important shair who had migrated from Kohat region. And they used to have these shairi competitions and they would talk about it earlier. But since he's not there, his family is there, they remember that the kind of shairi he used to say, and these were the kind of cultural competitions earlier. Now I'm not sure, I probably need to look more into details. Yeah.
Yes. Anyhow, Jawaharlal Nehru, as we know, was opposed to the settlement of partition migrants in Kashmir because he thought that would dissolve the identity of Kashmir. And so not only Muslim leaders but our Hindu leaders and like Nehru and others were aware of the impact migration has on the identity of regions. So these regions that you've spoken of, Faridabad and what is today Haryana, is a non-Punjabi region. So when they were settled here, were they indifferent to the identity of this area? Did they think it was unworthy of preservation? Only Kashmir was worthy of preservation? Or, was the identity irrelevant here? And following from that, this is the bias in all partition studies, and some of it emerged from the questions also. They're all written from the point of view of, the people who came here. Nobody's bothered about the people who lived here and the impact it had on them, whether it reduced their opportunities and so forth. So, this question, were the leaders unconcerned about the identity? Did they think it's unworthy of preservation?
I think it's a very important question because Faridabad has led to displacement. It might have led to replacing it with the displaced community, but they did displace the people who were there initially. And there is not much evidence. It talks about how these people were given compensation, given lands outside Faridabad in different regions, but it doesn't talk in detail where to get hold of these people or where they'd moved out. So it was a displacement of a community, the farming community or whatever, at that point in time. And there's not much evidence to talk about that. So in the process of resettlement, you're causing another displacement. That is something which I also need to look into future. And identities, it's very important what you're talking about. So they are imposing a certain kind of identity because they knew that they could not deal with frontier. I don't have the picture today, but frontier provinces, these people, they were supposed to be very Pathan-like. So they actually staged a demonstration outside Teen Murti. 40,000 of them went and sat, and they said 15th August is coming, 1949, and we are going to stage a protest right outside. They all sat in Nehru's home and said that we want a place. So again, assertion of a certain identity, which they knew this was an exigency, and Faridabad wouldn't have come up if partition wouldn't have happened this way, right? So the whole nature and morphology of Faridabad changes just because of one event, partition. And but I would want to look at what are the identities of the people who earlier stayed and where they moved out.
No, I mean, you just, it's not the, don't dismiss it as a farming community or this. They are as much a people as, say, the Punjabis or the Kashmiris or Bengalis or anybody else. I mean, this is the middle Yamuna. It's a very anciently settled part of India. It has its own distinct character. Faridabad would have continued regardless of whether the refugees had come. There's still, it's not true that there are no Abadi regions there. There are Abadi regions. Nehapar has lots of Abadi regions. This is a very densely populated part of the country. All of it has Abadis. Maybe a particular section was cleared, but it's not true that it was virgin land or, I mean, there were lots of Abadi regions. This is farming country. It's right next to the Yamuna. It's a very rich farming country.
Yeah. I mean, except for the fact that these people were given compensation, they moved out, where did they go and all. So maybe I need to look further into it. Where did they settle? Where were they resettled?
I was interested in knowing what was the relationship between Faridabad and Delhi in the 1950s and 60s that you're talking about. Because it's all very well to imagine that we would relocate a trading class into a new town, but so I was asking you what was the relationship between Faridabad and Delhi in the 1950s and 60s, because it's all very well to say that we will create a new town for these refugees, etc., and create new forms of living, etc., but what did it mean to relocate a trading class away from what I'm assuming was the major urban center called Delhi? So what was the relationship there? And if they were not, for instance, taking employment in industries, what is the relationship?
So most of these refugees who were settled in 1950s, they were given task in Indian Cooperative Union where they would do weaving or small basketry, and those things would be come and sold in Delhi. Whatever they were making as cottage industries kind of stuff, that was they were given training. Yeah, they were given training, vocational training. So they were coming and selling that in Delhi. Plus, some of them would actually come to Delhi, buy the products from Delhi, Chandni Chowk and all, suits and all, go and sell it in Faridabad to do their additional earning. But the whole idea of Faridabad was that Delhi should not become an industrial town, and that becomes very important with the master plan Delhi, which completely says that this much population has to move to Faridabad, which is not the NWFP population. In 60s, it's the another population of Delhi, which is the dispersal of certain people, which says that they should be moved eventually, or Faridabad population should eventually grow up, and that's why we are putting Faridabad as an industry on the industrial map, so that these industries will be the serving point, and they did not want certain kind of nuisance industries in Delhi. All kinds of industries, rubber industries, and even most the initial industries were the steel industries, infrastructural industries, and the first 3-4 industries was Bata Shoe Company, which came, and Janki Das Cycles, and even Delhi Cloth Mill. That had Lala Shriram was part of this whole planning of Faridabad industrial section. And so initially it was these industries, but later on, as I said, once these refugees kind of started moving out of these industries, building up their own shopping centers and going back to their trade occupation, right? So because they did not feel like workers, they said initially it's okay to rehabilitate ourselves, and once Indian Cooperative Union shuts down there, right? That was very important because Indian Cooperative Union was supposed to give them the democratic space and give them their own way of starting their livelihood. But once ICU shut down in Faridabad for various reasons, this is in 1954. Yeah, ICU shuts down completely in Faridabad, Indian Cooperative Union. So people said, let's go back to our trade and profession. And doing our petty trade in terms of shopkeeping and all. And that's when the migrants from other parts of India start moving in to Faridabad to serve in these industries.
Can I have one question? You said in 1959 Gurgaon was bifurcated. 79 Gurgaon was bifurcated into Faridabad and Gurgaon. So if they were all together earlier, then it would be like Gurgaon would suffice for agriculture and the water or something like this is an industrial area. So the bifurcation itself is like causing a more problem, like it is segregating this as a complete industrial area and this is complete residential area.
Industrial area what? Because Faridabad industry...
It is an industrial area, but earlier it was adjoined with Gurgaon. So it was with Gurgaon. So this could be an industrial area where this could be...
No, but see, there was no... Gurgaon was not supposed to develop at all because there was no water table there, right? So Faridabad always was seen as the industrial and the residential area. Gurgaon was started developing in 1979 because of the various reasons. For 80 onwards, when the liberalization happens, Maruti comes in Gurgaon, they started seeing it as another avenue to open up. And the private sector becomes very important in developing Gurgaon. There is no planning as such. There is no government planning involved in Gurgaon.
So what is the importance of this bifurcation?
It's just probably you can say a state bifurcation just for more administrative reasons. As I said, if you look at the way Gurgaon has developed, it's much more unplanned city. And Faridabad had a municipal corporation and all. So Gurgaon, when the private developers become very important in developing Gurgaon, and I think that was probably in the earlier sense why the bifurcation takes place, though it's always ostensibly in the name of administration, that it's better to administer a smaller unit vis-a-vis a bigger unit. But later on, I'm sure they had this in mind. Why they were doing is the private sectors will play a major role in developing Gurgaon, which was not the case and which will not be the case in Faridabad.
Shall we conclude? Any more questions? No? Okay. Thank you very much, Rachna, for your compelling presentation. And we hope to see you in about 1 month. It's not here, but I guess so, in about 1 month.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, all.
Thank you all.